This is kind of the last time that we're going to look at the ways that colonized people began to resist imperialism, and also how Europeans themselves kind of came to question certain aspects about imperialism. We talked about how terrible it was for the people that were subjected to this new type of imperialism and the new ways in which they basically set back half the world's population in terms of being able to advance technologically and really created the idea of third world by the Europeans doing what they did during this time frame. So when we look at imperialism from the perspective of the colonized people, we can see that many of them wanted to resist this Western imperialism, right? But there was only a couple pathways that were really open to them being able to resist. One of the pathways to resist was through Westernization. And this is the pathway taken by like the Indian National Congress, and I'm not talking about like the Indians, what we call Indians in the United States, but like actual Indians from India. They formed the Indian National Congress in 1885, and they were a group of Indian nationalists who got together. They organized politically. They tried to advocate for Indian involvement in British rule, and with basically the eventual goal that this is going to move India towards independence on their own. The argument that the Indian National Congress was making was basically to the British Parliament, and essentially that, that the British civilizing mission had worked. And if you remember about the civilizing mission, it was this idea that Western powers are going in, with benevolence to westernize and civilize these uncivilized nations and make them better. Well, the Indian people are like, hey, if we tell them it worked, maybe they'll leave us alone. Look how civilized we are now, and then we can take our own country back. And so the problem is that Westernization provides very limited opportunity to resist these, European changes, because the Europeans kept moving the goalposts, as to say. And so no matter how educated they became, you'd never be as educated as a Westerner. No matter how civilized you became, you were never going to be as civilized as Europeans. And so it does certainly limit the ability to push back. And also, Britain is not really interested in allowing India to industrialize, because if India industrializes with their population and their resources, the British fear that if they gain independence and then they're industrialized, they'll become competition. And the whole point of this new imperialism was to eliminate competition to make themselves richer. And so they had basically prevented these countries from doing that. So India is going, hey, we should just go ahead and do what they're asking us to do. Then we can say, hey, we're free. Well, Britain's like, well, yeah, you did do what we asked you to do, but that was just phase one, right? And so they're going to move the goalposts. The British basically had complete rule over India's industries. And so we can see that Westernization is something that, these countries start to say, hey, if we go ahead and embrace Westernization, maybe we can become independents. But that's not really going to work in the way that these countries think it is going to work. The other major pathway to try and resist imperialism was to go the opposite direction. Basically, to not embrace Westernization at all, but rather embrace and hold on tight and cling to your own national identity. And this is what ends up happening with what's known as the Boxer Rebellion. This breaks out in China in 1898. And so we get the name Boxers from the Chinese name for this group of freedom fighters. And their name, fully translates as righteous harmony, and so their symbol is like the fist, right? And so it's kind of a style of fighting that looks similar to the European boxing, so the Europeans call them the Boxers. Now, the goal of this Boxer Rebellion was to eliminate Western influence from China altogether. So the Indians say, hey, we'll embrace it, and maybe they'll leave us alone. The Chinese say, no, how about this? How about we just eliminate it completely and get them out of here, and then they can't do anything. So the Boxer warriors get together, they start to launch attacks against Westerners and against Chinese Christians who are seen to have colluded with the West. And they start this uprising in China to try and kick the Europeans and the Americans out of their country. The problem with this particular mode of resistance, however, as you can probably imagine, is that they aren't industrialized, which means their armies can't actually defeat Western armies because modern technologies of the military are going to decimate them. A coalition of forces joined together: Italy, the United States, France, Austria, Japan, Germany, Britain, Russia. They all band together because they have all set up spheres of influence inside of China. They're all taking advantage of the vast resources there. And so they're all like, no, China, you don't get to end our gravy train. And so they all band together to put down this rebellion. And even though the Boxers claimed that their martial arts style of fighting would magically protect them from Western bullets, they were wrong. Yeah. They clearly did not, and because bullets don't care if you know Kung Fu or whatever they know at all. And so the Boxer Rebellion gets suppressed. Now, the outcome of this is that China is not fully able to break away from Western imperialism. In fact, the opposite occurs. After the Boxer Rebellion is put down, China was actually forced to open itself even further to Western influence. So we can see this pathway of embracing tradition would not be effective means of resistance either. Now, this continued all the way until the Chinese had the communist revolution under Mao Zedong. And really, if you think about it, they saw capitalism as the problem with their country. Western imperialism and capitalism is what tore their country apart. So if you think for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, the push of stealing their resources and stuff and capitalizing off of their economy was so strong that the opposite reaction to that is going to end up being the communist revolution that takes place there, that really even lasts until today. So you can see that, that really didn't turn out well for the Chinese either. India, now an independent country. China, still communist. I mean, I guess they're independent, but life sucks there. Because during COVID, if you got COVID, your entire building got locked in the building and weren't allowed to get food, and they just starved millions of people to death, or hundreds of thousands of people because they didn't want to spread COVID. So there you go. If you look at the example of Ethiopia, we can see that some resistance was possible if a country resisting one of the weaker if they were resisting a weaker European power. So Ethiopia had basically signed a treaty with Italy called the Treaty of Friendship. The Ethiopians looked at this basically as a treaty saying, hey, we're friends. But Italy interpreted this as basically, you're agreeing that we're your imperial overlords. So the Ethiopians are like, oh, great, we signed this treaty, we're friends. And the Italians are like, yes, we are friends who steal everything from you and tell you what to do with your lives. And the Ethiopians were like, oh, that's not what we meant. Obviously, the Ethiopians aren't very happy with this. And so the emperor there decides that he needed to resist the imperial takeover. And so he begins the process of going through this route of westernization. Through this route, he's able to purchase weapons from the West, and he trains his military to use the most modern military training. And when the Italians bring their military to Ethiopia in 1896 to fight against them, that doesn't turn out well because the Italians, they don't have the best military in Europe. In fact, they're basically counting on the ideas that Europeans are just better than Ethiopians. And so this doesn't go as planned for the Italians. They meet the Ethiopians in the Battle of Adawa. And because the emperor had westernized his army, he's able to defeat this unprepared Italian force and actually ends up defeating Italy. He forces them to sign the Treaty of Addis Ababa, which recognizes Ethiopian independence. And so we do see that a non-Western country is able to successfully resist imperialism You know, and so remember way back we talked about the idea that I showed you that map of all those countries in Africa that had been colonized. Do y'all remember that basically like 15 countries owned like 80% of the world? But one of the only countries that wasn't was Ethiopia. That's why, because they kind of said, well, we're going to do a hybrid between what India did and what China did. We're going to westernize enough to where we can get an army together, and then once they try and enforce it, we have a good army and we can actually fight back like China wanted to. And I think that, you know, it's very successful, but it's because they're going up against basically the weakest European power. If they had been going against Britain or Germany, I think the case would have been very different. But I think the main reason that the path of westernization worked for them was that India is trying to resist Britain. Britain has a much stronger hold. They had been there for generations. The Italians basically didn't have much of a foothold at all. And so the Ethiopians are able to play that to their advantage to resist them. It should be noted that, you know, it's really a kind of a temporary reprieve from imperialism, because prior to World War II, the Italians are again going to go back to Ethiopia. This time they're going to be backed up by German military technology and from Adolf Hitler, and they're going to basically come in and take over the country. But we're going to see that Ethiopia is able to remain independent during this time, but eventually they are going to fall into the hands of the Italians. So we've seen some ways that Native people try to resist imperialism. It's important to note that there are some Europeans themselves who are questioning these tactics. We have a political cartoon that kind of calls into question this idea of, you know, a white man's burden. Notice how it's titled The White Man's Burden right here. The white question mark man's burden. Notice, and so you have, you know, some prominent white men, namely Uncle Sam and John Bull. It looks like a German guy being carried on the backs of the colonized people. And it really calls into question, you know, is imperialism really a burden for the white man, or is it a burden for the black and brown man who's having the biggest burden to carry the white people to success, right? Who's really the burden on? Because these countries try to act like, oh, we have to put these countries on our backs to carry them to, you know, advance society. No, it doesn't seem like that's what's happening. It seems like you're taking advantage of these people to make yourselves better and using them as slave labor for that. And so there is some perspective on that people are starting to realize, like, oh, this is messed up. But the idea of a civilizing mission also gets called into question by the actions of some Europeans that are taken in the colonies. One example of this, it would be the Belgian Congo. And what happens here is during the quote-unquote scramble for Africa, the King of Belgium, King Leopold II, seizes the Congo area in Central Africa. And basically, he makes it his own personal colony. He doesn't go there to run it. Instead, he leaves the running of the colony in the hands of the Anglo-Belgian Rubber Company. And the reason why he wants this colony is because the Belgian Congo is a good source of rubber, natural rubber. And so he gets this company to run the colony in his name. And the purpose of this is to extract all the natural rubber that they can. And this is going to make him very wealthy. And this wealth is going to be coming back to Belgium. But the way the company goes about this is atrocious. The company's soldiers commit many atrocities against the Congolese people. This is going to start a backlash against King Leopold and raises questions about the nature of imperialism itself. So we begin to see some of these questions of King Leopold, and you have an actual photograph of the king on the left there. But in the center is an image produced of King Leopold, kind of showing him gaining and getting rich and hoarding his money, while in the background you see, you know, people brutalizing the Congolese people. And on the right, we have a kind of a staged picture here of soldiers in the Anglo-Belgian Rubber Company, you know, punishing the Congolese men if they did not collect the amount of rubber that the soldiers would demand of them. And so they would frequently be whipped in this way. They'd strip them naked, lay them on the ground, and then just whip them on the ground. And it immediately starts to raise questions about whether or not this imperialism idea is actually doing what it was set out to do. In actuality, the Congolese were being treated quite harshly by these Anglo-Belgian rubber company soldiers, and we have images of the Congolese men looking at the severed hand and foot of his daughter, someone who was punished because he did not bring the required amount of rubber that was demanded of him. Legit. Here's the dude. They cut off his daughter's hand and foot because he didn't collect enough rubber that day. Yeah. This is a civilizing mission, everyone. We're just doing this to civilize them. Tell them about Jesus. So clearly that's not going to help the cause any. We have some more pictures of the atrocities done to the people. You can see they're victims of the Anglo-Belgian Rubber Company. They've been mutilated, not being able to fulfill their required production of natural rubber or resisting the company in some other way. And these images they're sending out to the public, just horrifying the readers in Europe and America who are seeing this. And it really undermines the whole kind of notion of the civilizing mission because obviously we're not improving their lives. This is clearly not an improvement. And so the campaign becomes part of a larger campaign for human rights that even involves people like Mark Twain, who is a very famous American journalist and novelist. He starts to write about the atrocities that have been committed in the Congo. He ends up writing a whole book against King Leopold called the King Leopold Soliloquy. And it's a satire in which he, satirizes the king. And he paints the king out to be this greedy guy who's gone to the Congo and is treating people very harshly to make a lot of money. So this is a little excerpt from the book. And again, it's a satirical voice saying, well, in the early years, you kind of saying we had no trouble in getting the press to expose the tales, and you have slander and lies and interventions of, American missionaries and otherwise. In other words, at the very beginning, they're saying, all this stuff is basically fake news. The king's saying, that's not real pictures. But you can clearly see all these people that don't have, arms and hands and feet. It's kind of hard to deny that. And so there's major backlash against this. The photos of the mutilations turn public opinion against the king. You can see the British cartoon depicting the king as sort of a rubber vine that's attacking the people. The people of Belgium rise up and demand the king step away from the colony, hand it back over to the Belgian government. And the king does. However, while the major atrocities do come to an end, the effect of this continues to linger in the Congo. While the king doesn't have direct control, the people of the Congo certainly did not gain independence. And the Belgian government continues to take the raw materials from the country, and the wealth ends up in the hands of Europeans, and the people in the Congo are left poor and impoverished. And so we see this is encouraging Europeans to kind of question this whole colonizing practice. And so this when he gets removed, this backlash against imperialism kind of dies down a little bit, but it still remains and still is very, very detrimental to the people there. It's actually another conflict or another issue that caused many Europeans to begin to question the practice of imperialism. And it's in the context of the Second Boer War in South Africa. Starts in 1899. South Africa, you look at this little map that we have down here in the right-hand corner, or left-hand corner, and you can see that South Africa is divided into a British portion and a Dutch portion. The British portion is in the yellowish, and then the darker part is the Dutch. And the Dutch are known as the Boers, which is the Dutch word for farmer. The Boers had lived in South Africa since basically the 1600s. And the Dutch immigrants who had come to South Africa, they remained there. And in fact, they identified themselves as Africans. They were known as Africans, Afrikaners, or white Africans. And the British start moving in. They create this conflict between the Dutch and the British in South Africa. Particularly, the Dutch discovered gold and diamond mines in their region. Of course, the British want access to those. And they resent the fact that they are going to have to abide by Dutch taxation and labor policies. And so one particular British imperialist named Cecil Rhodes they basically decide they're going to expand British control into the Dutch portion of South Africa. And they're going to build this transcontinental rail from Cape Town, South Africa to Cairo, Egypt, and that they're going to bring basically this big portion of Africa under British control. And since they have this incredible military, they're basically able to do this. And the war breaks out between the British and the Dutch. And it's pretty humiliating for the British, honestly. It really tarnishes their British military and humanitarian reputation. These people are fighting for their own land, so they're going to fight very fiercely against the British. They're able to beat the British army back because, they're kind of they start with this guerrilla warfare tactics that the British army isn't using. And so, they start to kind of make fun of the British losses. You can see here Queen Victoria is, giving a British soldier chocolate while he's being beaten by a guy named Paul Kruger, which was kind of the president of this area. And so basically they're saying, hey, we're spanking y'all, literally. And so it really kind of makes the British look pretty bad. They decide to start responding with new military tactics, which are going to call their humanitarian reputation into question. They start to adopt something called scorched earth tactics, where the war fighters, they're fighting with this guerrilla warfare. So what they would do is they'd come down to their farms, grab some supplies, go running up into the hills, and make the British chase after them. Then, once the British got there, they would ambush them, right? So the British basically decide, we just need to cut off their supplies. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to burn down the houses and farms of everyone. Then there's nowhere for the Dutch to get their supplies from anymore, and we don't have to chase them up into the hills. They have to come crawling to us because they're starving to death. They're not going to kill women and children that are going to remain behind in the farms, but basically they are going to put them into essentially concentration camps. And the problem that they don't exactly plan is how many women and children, of course, they're going to end up capturing. Also, the African servants with them. And so they put these people in camps, and the British don't have enough food supplies because, they burn all the crops and all the fields and all the supplies. And so you can see that these people become very malnourished. I mean, you can see this camp is as far as you can see. And so this gets out to the British public that basically they're starving people in Africa on purpose, women and children, and this is really going to look bad on the British. Clearly, when people are starving children, doesn't look good, and it's going to call into question, what is really happening here with the British. Also, it's going to be very costly for the British in terms of lives. About 20,000 are killed on the side of the British, 14,000 Dutch troops, Boer troops, 26,000 Boer women and children are going to starve to death. 13 to 20,000 Africans are going to starve. And so this really, really looks bad on the British and is going to bring a vast number of Europeans and Americans wholeheartedly against this idea of imperialism. So, historical significance. What can we learn by looking at it from both the European and colonized perspective? Well, I think we can see that European dominance does help spread aspects of Western culture and political thinking. It provides a basis from which the colonies could then argue for independence. It's not fully successful, though. The path to Westernization is one that does start to undermine the idea of imperialism because, you start having these people say, hey, what about liberty? What about life? What about property? What about all these things that y'all are, preaching? But we're not going to see that really overturn imperialism until after World War II. We also see technology coming out of this time that helps Europeans establish control over the colonies. As missionaries and journalists capture the images of the negative aspects of imperialism, they're going to share those with the world. And that's going to bring about an end and have, not an end, but people to question it, whether it was worth it. And it really dispels this myth of Western superiority, because clearly the Westerners are not on the right side of this. And so, you know, you kind of look at it where you kind of have to understand that, you know, basically they're going to look stupid and it's not going to turn out well for them at all. And so by the time we get to World War II, there's really no justification for continuing this mass imperialism, but it really starts during this time frame.